Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl, and welcome back to Compassion in a T-shirt, where we explore the science and practice of compassion and how compassion changes everything. Today, we're turning our attention to education. What if one of the most important factors in a child's learning isn't simply what is being taught, but the emotional relationship between teacher and student? And what if the well-being of teachers themselves is one of the keys in helping students flourish? My guest today is Dr. Rita Princi-Hubbard, a clinical psychologist, educator, researcher, and founder of the Institute for Neuroscience and Education. Rita has spent more than 20 years working with teachers, students, and schools, helping translate complex neuroscience and psychological research into practical strategies that support learning, well-being, and human connection. Her recent PhD explored the fascinating bidirectional relationship between teachers and students, how emotional regulation, stress, and well-being can flow between them. Drawing on neuroscience, compassion-focused therapy, and educational research, Rita developed and evaluated a compassion-focused teacher training program designed to help educators better understand both their students and themselves. In this conversation, we'll be discussing Rita's chapter, Teaching the New Teacher with Compassionate Pedagogy, from the book Compassionate Pedagogy in Higher Education. We'll explore what happens when teachers understand not only how students work, but how they themselves work, and why compassion may be one of the most important ingredients in creating emotionally safe, connected, and effective learning environments. And so I bring you Dr. Rita Princi-Hubbard. Dr. Rita Princi-Hubbard, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thank you for having me, Stan. I'm a big fan of Compassion in a T-shirt, so happy to be part of it. So thanks for the invitation.
Great. Wonderful to have you. You've spent more than 20 years working as a clinical psychologist with teachers and students. Was there a particular moment there or an experience or some sort of pattern that perhaps you kept seeing that convinced you that maybe something important was missing from teacher education?
That's a very good question. Yes, because it did take a while to see what was happening. Teachers obviously, look at how to support students. And what I noticed as I was giving workshops to teachers and working primarily with children and adolescents, I would then obviously work with teachers a lot, was the understanding about what's happening when children were becoming dysregulated and not really understanding how the impact of their own emotional I suppose, responses were impacting. So I found that, teacher and student well-being and regulation is inseparable. So I wanted to show that that's actually what's happening, and hence why it led to my research.
The idea of stress contagion, I think, is in your chapter is sort of a striking idea. It really stood out to me because I often think about it in therapy work as well, that sometimes the therapist can be feeling threat system activated and the client too, but you've been exploring that in teachers and students. So can you explain what perhaps the stress contagion might mean and what you've observed there?
Yes. So what's happening is, I suppose, when we have stressed teachers without them realizing, that can also, in a bidirectional effect, affect students, but also the other way around. So there's lots of research that tells us the parasympathetic nervous system takes a hit, and so does the vagus nerve. So that reserve that teachers might need to support students, if they're not looking after their own well-being, then that stress can filter on over to the students. During my research, one of the teachers, after participating in the modules, so she was from the intervention school, said it really made sense to her that these were her words, if I came to school feeling crazy, and I think she meant overwhelmed, tired, whatever was going on in her world, she noticed the whole class would be crazy. And after understanding and following this more compassion-focused approach and psychoeducation to understand what was happening for herself, she was more able then to look after herself, which she noticed absolutely spread throughout the whole class. So yes, really, in practical terms, there's something you can actually see when it's happening. But stress is catchy, and especially if it's a teacher or an adult and a child, and you, as you say, a therapist. So being aware, I think, was the most important message there.
What are some of the, like, what's it like to be a teacher these days? Can you sort of give us a feeling there, the sorts of stressors that perhaps they face, or the things that can begin some of this stress contagion?
Yes, and I think I was very privileged to work with teachers during my research, and it was a multi sort of approach where I did have interviews with them. I did have some measures, and then, as we'll talk about shortly, probably had heart rate variability measures. But through the interviews, what became very clear was that, the expectations, I suppose, from leadership about what they needed to get done. Many stressed parents also wanting certain things for their children, but sometimes teachers not being aware of what was going on with students. I was told that perhaps that's shared with leadership, but not with teachers. So teachers are in the classroom unaware that perhaps something's happened in that child's life that could be affecting them that day. Then, all the extracurricular things they need to do with the school, the reports and other, responsibilities they have, all, culminating together. And one thing that stood out too was perhaps not being fully aware and understanding what's happening with child development and what's happening for themselves with psychoeducation. They're really not receiving that in their pre-service training. So all of those combined, and I think the expectations on teachers, we all hear comments about teachers, they've got all these holidays and, this expectation that they're meant to have everything together and that life's easy. Whereas my perspective always has been, I'm here to provide my experience and my knowledge to support them. After all, they're teaching our next generation. So that's why that's so important. So it's understandable that that's very stressful. And I also saw in the undergraduate teacher training, perhaps they're not being equipped with the right tools so that when they are working with students, they understand what's happening for students, but also for themselves, which then led me to develop this program to see if I can answer some of those questions and fill in the blanks for them.
This idea about teachers and holidays and all that sort of stuff, I don't know if misnomer is not the right word, but it's a misinterpretation of things, really, isn't it? I mean, because quite often teachers are spending their holidays doing extra preparation or still working on things, and there are these many and varied pressures coming from admin or sort of kind of from above, coming from parents on the outside, perhaps even aspects between teachers as well can sometimes be a part of that, and of course the students. And it's interesting, yeah, you mentioned there that sometimes it might be things about the students that they're not actually fully aware of, that they haven't been informed about, and so they're also operating a little bit in the dark sometimes, and really just keeping their head above water, I suppose.
Exactly. And unfortunately, trauma and other diagnoses, are increasing as well, and teachers are unaware how to approach it, but also it creates challenges if students have extra needs and if, especially emotionally, and how to support them and how overwhelming that can be for a teacher. So if they're in their own, I suppose, anxiety responses in trying to manage so many students. One thing I noticed, part of the research, was that I would be in a classroom with cameras filming the teacher to see what they were doing. And I noticed how many, all these students, up to 30 students sometimes, all needing the teacher, and the teacher ensuring that they were, going over to the students and working with them. And I thought of myself as a psychologist, the beauty of having one child and perhaps their parents. And even that can be difficult and challenging depending on whatever the reason is they're there. But to have all of those children depending on you and having to ensure that they're all getting what they need, I really had such respect for them as I sat there and filmed the session for all the teachers I worked with. So I think that's important too, to recognise that there's a lot of children in that room that need their attention, and how that can be overwhelming, especially if there are needs there that they're not understanding how to meet for them.
I love your multiple methods of assessment, and we will get back to that. But that's a great example, just the sort of observation, on the ground, and seeing the many and varied roles, I suppose, the teacher is playing, because they sort of expect to be kind of teaching people, but it really goes a long way beyond that, I suppose, in terms of all of the challenges that young people are facing and trying to support them in that, and things emotionally or behaviourally or socially, and depending on, I guess, too, the age group that they might be working with. What did you notice? It's just popped to mind, but yeah, what did you notice about even feelings of shame there, where teachers, with the enormity of the role, start to worry, like I'm not good enough, or I'm inadequate, or the teacher next door is so much better than me, and just that sort of almost teacher shame. What are your thoughts there?
That is important to note, because I had pre and post interviews, and I noticed that yes, teachers were more inclined to believe that either the student wasn't listening to them or deregulating because the teacher was doing something wrong, or for themselves. Interestingly, one of the interviews occurred just before a teacher needed to speak to a colleague, and they were quite concerned about that. So the interview was more about how are they going to manage that, and whether it would be successful or not. So it's that personal sense of, I'm not doing this properly, something's wrong, but also perhaps that sense of being judged or criticised by colleagues or parents. So there is, I think, that underlying impact there, and then how that impacts when they're in the classroom, how much they, I suppose, rely on their talent or their skills to be able to teach and engage and connect with students. But that was definitely there, especially for the intervention school, or both schools before. But I noticed that after, thankfully, the modules, that there was a shift there. So, and understanding why that might be there.
Mm. You've mentioned the intervention school and so on. Just give us a bit of maybe give us a little bit of the methodology, perhaps, there, just as we continue talking. There was an intervention school and perhaps a control school or something like that.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's right. Yes, I should clear that. Yes, so interesting, my research was conducted during COVID, so I did have more schools, but unfortunately, due to those restrictions, I ended up with 2, which in the end, because I had so many ways of collecting data, it probably was a much more sensible way to do it. So, yeah, so 2 schools, both had interviews following. I observed a class being taught. So interviews where I asked specific questions about how they interact with students, how do they support students, how do they support themselves, what do they need. I then had measures that they completed about how they viewed their relationship with students and what they saw in students and what they thought that was. So child behaviour checklist for parents, but teacher rating forms for teachers. And I should say parents had a little bit in there too, just to see whether they noticed any shifts. And students completed measures too. So I had the students also report how close they believed they were to the teacher, how they viewed their relationship with the teacher, and their emotional well-being. Teachers did that as well. And then we had the heart rate variability measures, which means teachers wore heart rate monitors, and so did 5 students. Now, this occurred pre and post. So the intervention are my 8 modules that I put together with a compassion-focused approach, with psychoeducation, science of learning, to really help understand child development, and put that all together in 8 modules with lots of practical strategies. And I think that's where my experience came in as a clinical psychologist, that I was able to explain this. And then when teachers had practical, I suppose, situations they wanted to share with me, we could then apply that to the actual situations that they were experiencing. Now, the control school didn't get the actual modules in the middle there. They got them at the other end. And so that's what happened. I was able to compare what were the responses after the intervention and the teachers that didn't. I have to say that all the teachers, there's no lack of compassion. Teachers are compassionate. It's a very difficult job. And bringing compassion in wasn't me saying, oh, I don't think you're compassionate enough, you're not being kind or caring enough. It was more to help them understand what's underlying here. What are the emotional, origins of this behaviour? Where is it coming from? How are you looking after yourself? Are your needs being met? And that compassion is action, as you know very well, Stan, with all the work that you do. So it's not just empathy, it's it's something that we do to actually alleviate stress for ourselves or for others. And I think that's what really helped. That we're not saying you need to be nicer or kinder. If that comes out, definitely that's not the message I want to give. It's more about understanding that they're giving a lot, but they're not really understanding why a student is reacting the way they are, and they're not really understanding what's happening for themselves. And so that then looks like behavioural problems. Rather, it's more a co-dysregulation situation.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting. It's a way of almost compassionately trying to frame what the teachers are then observing in the classroom. I don't know if this is a tough question, but can you list for us the 8 modules, like maybe the titles or something, like just to give us a feel of the flow of things?
Yes, I'll do my best. So the first is an introduction where we talk about all of this and just explain what will happen. I have looked at AITSL, so to ensure that, the teaching standards, to ensure that I meet some of the criteria in there, so teachers can use it for professional development. That's in there. There's a pre and a post quiz as well. So I explain all this in the first module. There's recommended readings. There are also reflection opportunities at the end. So really setting up the first module explains all of that. But, we look at things like brain development in children across the board. We look at a compassion approach to understanding how children, when they may dysregulate. Each module, though, also involves teachers, like what's happening for you as this is happening. So they're understanding that. We look at attachment. As we know, attachment is huge. Neuroscience and understanding what's going on in the regulatory system. So understanding, if the parasympathetic system's active, we have the vagal nerve that's, active as well. So more able to respond to stressors other than, if we are depleted. There's a wellbeing measure for teachers as well. So really focus on that. There's a module about trauma and really looking at what that looks like and how that can be misinterpreted. And that teachers may have their own trauma responses. I think a really important part of all of this is, and I've tried to do this in a clinical way, is that when we're talking about child development, and yes, it's important to know what the different stages of development are and what the critical periods are, but teachers have also been through that. We've all grown and developed. Are there things in our past or in their stages of life that may have impacted the way they're responding? With attachment, we know that, the way a parent attaches with their child has been influenced by the way their parents have attached with them. But this is true with teachers and students. That was a really important a finding from my research as well. So if a teacher's had a certain attachment style, he or she will attach differently to their students. So having all this information, and then the last module is really practical strategies. Let's look at everything we've got, and teachers and firing scenarios to me, and lots of. I have 2 books that I've put together, handout books that they can take away with them, and all the strategies that we've talked about. But the most important thing is that talk about understanding. It's not just about having strategies. If we don't know what the problem is, if we haven't got to the core, if we haven't got the mechanisms to understand what's underlying here emotionally, psychologically, physiologically, then we may be using the wrong strategy. And what is a strategy that the teacher needs? And maybe strategy is a hard word, but what do they need for themselves? What's happening? Well, my 3 are validation first, then what's happening here, and having enough information. And that's what I'm trying with my modules. Can I give enough information you can answer that question, rather than what's wrong with me or what's wrong with this child? What's happening, and then what do I need before I then engage with this child, and having information about what might be happening to meet the child's needs. So hopefully that's explained it. But and I try and flow them on with each other so that they, you sort of can see that building to the answers, and including opportunity for teachers to ask questions throughout.
I feel like the CFT message of it's not our fault, but it is our responsibility is kind of coming through there. That the making sense through information and education and understanding and awareness, making sense of both the student and the teacher's behaviours, and kind of stepping away from a more blaming approach, but still working towards what to do to help people manage the situation in a way that that perhaps is still really effective. I liked what you said there, because it seems that compassionate education isn't just about how teachers might treat students, although that's a very important, obviously, aspect of it too. But your work really suggests that self-compassion for teachers may be just as important. Tell us
Yes.
about the self-compassion for teachers piece.
Absolutely. In some ways, I think it's the most important, as we would say to a parent, but most important. If we have a teacher who is understanding what's happening for them, if they have needs that aren't being met, and that's something that we talked about, if they're sleep deprived, if they're, having issues in their own life that haven't been addressed. Sometimes, in the session, in one of the workshops there, one of the modules, I should say, we talked about, they may get home and they realize they're really tired and they probably should go to bed early, but they've got all these reports to mark, or there's something else happening. So they delay that. They acknowledge it. They can pick up that there's something happening, but not having the time or believing they have the time to look after that need. And that's what's linked to burnout. So identifying the need, but not even having the time to actually fulfill that need. And so being mindful of where they're at and why they're important. I know it's the same analogy we use in so many situations, but, the oxygen mask first on the teacher, and then you're more able to connect and understand the child. And I think as teachers practice self-compassion and are able to meet their own needs, they're going to have more resources. Their parasympathetic nervous system will be fuller. And if we take, the notion of the vagal tank, and I know it's only one way to look at it, but, we've got more resources in there. They've got more to draw on. One of the things that was really interesting that came out too was that, we have this reaction in our parasympathetic nervous system when we notice a student is distressed, or we notice someone else is distressed and perhaps not understanding what that is. So if that brings on an anxiety response, then for the teacher, they'll be more likely to think that there's something wrong with the child or not understanding their own reaction. Whereas if they follow self-compassion and they can feel that tank, plus they're aware that this gives them more resources to draw from, I think that's helpful for themselves and obviously for their students. It's all that work by DeBello and others, which looked at understanding that when we do notice someone's distress, we actually take a physiological hit. So knowing that and then ensuring we've met our own needs, we're more likely to be able to help others. And hence, I thought that was very important for teachers to become aware of.
Yeah, really trying to get that balance across the flows, I suppose. And but how did teachers respond? Like, what did you know? What do you notice with teachers when you say self-compassion? I mean, did any of the particular fears, blocks, and resistances arise, or what was their response?
Not really, actually. One of the teachers said, he thanked me for the research and said, "You've really found the key to student wellbeing, and that's teacher wellbeing." And there weren't too many. I think what happened as well was that many of the things they were doing were really helpful, and I helped name it for them and to see what it was, and they could see why it was helpful, but then to add to it. Perhaps, yes, maybe I can also say there was a little bit of defensiveness, perhaps, in saying, what's the psychologist coming and telling teachers what to do? And I think you have to be really mindful, even presenting the workshops, working with teachers, that we come from a place of compassion to actually acknowledge what they do, that we're not here to tell them what to do, we're here to support them. And that's something I definitely tried to make clear in my PhD, that, as governments, as societies, as professionals, how do we support them and give them the tools that they need? And hence why in higher education, I think that's so important that they have that, so that when they do go into the classroom, they're aware of what could be happening here and how to approach it. Otherwise, I feel compassion towards them. I feel they're being put in a situation that perhaps they haven't got everything that they need. And I'm not saying my modules is giving them all of that, but it starts the thinking processes of what else could be going on here. And then hopefully that there's training at university level, but in their own PD, that they go looking for that, and that we can provide that for them in a way that helps them for themselves and then their students.
Perhaps some of the introductory stuff and the science around attachment and around the neuroscience of it and parasympathetic nervous system, perhaps all that really provides a rationale for them where they are able to buy in. So, sometimes when I've worked with teachers, and it's certainly not just teachers, but they are such good and decent people, and they're very socially minded and want to help and are often very compassionate and can sometimes be a bit self-sacrificing and have sort of really high standards of themselves and perhaps even slip into self-criticism. And so in that context, I've noticed self-compassion as an idea can be, a little bit hard to fully embrace, but yeah, not sure what you
absolutely.
found.
And I think, yes, that sense of deservingness, do I deserve to have this extra, or am I being selfish in some way, rather than it's so critical. And I think that's what I try to present it to them, that in helping themselves, they're more able to help others, and also how to receive and accept compassion from themselves, but also from others too. If someone's offering to help, do they accept that? That was actually the most interesting concept, I think, that they found. Looking after themselves, they could see, yes, I probably could do that better. But then maybe a colleague or a family member or someone may say, look, I've noticed, you seem like you're a bit, you're struggling here, or can I support you? Can I help you? And it might be no, I don't want to put you out. I'm a burden. So that was a really important part that I needed to focus on as well. And the way I explained it was to say, well, when they've noticed it, they've actually taken a hit. They're feeling it themselves. So when you say no, you both leave depleted. And so if they're a very compassionate person, they think, well, I don't want that person to leave depleted. So I need to accept it. So we both restore. And I think that was a good way for them to acknowledge that someone's noticed it. They genuinely are feeling it. So by accepting their help, it's actually beneficial for both, which to me is such a critical part of compassion.
There's a couple of little ways in there with the self-compassion. It's the idea of self-compassion helps us to sustain our compassion. So that was sort of one way in, and then with receiving compassion, it was kind of like to let that other person in to help you is also a little bit of a gift for them, or at least an opportunity for them to engage in a compassionate interaction in which, in a way, both parties can go away feeling just that little bit better. So yes, there's it's sort of all in the kind of conversation, isn't it? And the exploring and the delivery and finding ways around some of these barriers. I mean, you do draw on CFT.
Yes.
And of course, Paul Gilbert's 3 circles model or 3 systems model: threat, drive, and soothing. Yeah, tell us about that little piece specifically in terms of helping teachers, make sense of, well, I guess, difficult moments in the classroom, but in terms of both students and themselves.
Absolutely, yes. Well, as we know, it's a great model, and we know lovely James Kirby is taking it to all sorts of lengths now with this wonderful app as well. But I think it's great because it puts it into a nutshell. You see those 3 circles. You know that the red circle is saying, your frontal lobe's offline. You're not able. There's no Wi-Fi, and so you're stuck in that sense of distress. The system, sympathetic nervous system's activated. You can't think clearly, and it's a great way for teachers to see what's happening for students, but also for themselves. Or then getting stuck in the drive system where it's go, go, go. So I've got all this work to do. I need to get it done. And then getting stuck perhaps between the drive system and the threat system. So a lot of work, trying to get it done, getting really tired, and then really stressed, and back there again, bypassing the soothing system. And whenever I mention that, I could see the teacher saying, oh, that's me. What about sleep? Are you eating regularly during the day? Many of them would skip lunch and just get on to whatever else to prepare for the afternoon, or what's happening at home. Are they going for walks? Are they doing the things that they love to try and help with that, or just taking moments to do some mindfulness or whatever it is that they might need? So really helping explain that for themselves. And then I think it's a great way to help them see what's going on for students, and how can we help students then share that with teachers to be able to say, you know, I'm in this zone. And I think that's what I try to encourage them to use this with their students as well. And obviously there's lots of work to be done there and helping students understand that. But then I think the models that motivational system model is excellent in being able to explain, and you know, it gives you the key areas of the brains that are impacted, tells you what's happening emotionally, and what stress does to the body, and how we do need to calm that before we can actually effectively do work. And whenever I'd say we get stuck between the drive and the threat, and there are so many, you know, everyone's nodding, yes, that's me. I'm working really hard, and then I'm so stressed, and then I know I have to work harder. So they're really using all their resources, and I suppose we're heading for burnout. If and again, where self-compassion comes in to allow the soothing system to work there, and then I think doing it and knowing it helps understand others better as well. So that if you understand, and really the key, and you said this earlier, but the key message is, you know, helping teachers understand how they work, so they're more able to understand how children work. And that's one of the key messages I try to put through in my modules.
Yeah, that stress contagion is often, you know, just threat systems bouncing off each other in a way, and that sort of threat-based drive piece as well. You know, the trying to sort of do everything and all at once and perfectly, and getting caught in that threat-based drive. Self-criticism might sneak in there if things aren't quite going right. Bit of a funny question that's just popped to mind, and it might not have been covered in some of your interviews and so on. I just wondered whether teachers and students, I guess too, but teachers perceive the school, the workplace, as a place of safeness, or not so much a place of safeness, and more something more threat system based. What's your sense with that?
Yeah, very good question. I would say probably not as safe as perhaps it could be. I think there's feeling like there's a lot of judgment and criticism. I know when teachers wore heart rate monitors, because I wanted to look at what was going on with their stress levels, heart rate variability. At the end of those lessons, teachers would say, you know, we should wear these all day, and then we could give the readings to the principal. We could give the readings and just see what's happening for us during the day. So a lot of stress, unfortunately, and coming to school not really knowing what to expect sometimes, if they weren't, you know, if they weren't given all the information of what was happening for their class that day, or students that perhaps were very distressed and not really, and trying to help them to settle, but not having, again, the information of understanding what's going on or ways to know how to do that. So, yeah, I gathered there was, quite a bit of stress happening for them, you know, during and I suppose before they got there, in preparation.
It sort of, begs the question a little bit, doesn't it, about, on the one hand, the interventions with teachers and so on, and that was the focus of your research with very good results, and then also systemic interventions and how that might create, you know, sort of safe environments for people.
Absolutely.
So you've sort of had thoughts about behavior management, rewards and consequences. What does that sort of an approach perhaps miss then, really, in terms of, you know, what's happening there?
Well, I think what it misses is what's contributing to the behavior.
Yes.
You know, and I think this is unfortunately a challenge for teachers then. They've got a list of all these behavior modification strategies, but what are they applying it to? So I'm not saying we don't have behavior modification strategies. Yes, we need to do things to help support students, but if we don't understand where it's coming from, is it trauma at home? Are they, you know, have they slept that night because something's been going on? Have they eaten? Is there a health problem? Is it a learning problem? Where is this coming from? So that teachers are more able to apply a strategy that's actually effective and meets the need of whatever is going on. So if you don't have, and that's why I think information is power, you know, the more information we have and we understand what's usually happening for children at this age, what else could be happening at this moment, and understanding, again, if we understand what's going on in the threat system, and giving teachers that understanding for, psychoeducation for themselves, but then awareness of how to approach a child that's distressed or hiding. Some of the examples I would be giving, students hide under the table, or another student might rip up the work they need to do. Another student might throw the desk or, run out of the classroom. So if you're going to apply a strategy, let's understand what's happening. And that's what I think is the important part that's missing, getting to the core of let's look at what could be contributing here so that the strategy, which is usually engage and connect first, obviously, validate teacher regulation first, so they're more able to approach and help the engage and connect with the student to help them regulate. That's the bit that I think is missing.
It's what I really love about Paul's work is that, and he calls it compassion focused therapy. So it's sort of bringing a compassion focus to some of the many and varied things that teachers and schools might already do, and even, as you say, that this might still, behavioral management sort of approaches might still be a part of it, but can we sort of warm it up with some of those sort of elements of compassion, but also bring an understanding of the mind and the tricky brain and how all that might be at play seems really good.
Yeah, otherwise we're stuck on problem solving without understanding. So if we're spending 99% of the time problem solving, but we have no idea what we're trying to problem solve, then we may not be finding the most effective strategies. Whereas if we spend more time understanding, we probably have less time problem solving because we'll be on track as to provide what's needed to support the teacher and the student.
Yeah, with greater understanding comes greater helpfulness, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're solving the right problem rather than let's try all these strategies, but we don't know whether that's going to fit. And, the individual differences of students, some things will work for some students and some we won't. Even with attachment, if children come from, very insecure attachment, or there's been levels of trauma and abuse, a nice teacher who's being very compassionate sometimes can be punished by the student. They don't know what that is. They don't trust it. They see it as is that what happened before someone hurt them? So teachers need to know this, that, you're compassionate, but just be mindful. And if a student responds that way, what does a teacher do? Or you may have the student that's more clingy because they don't have someone at home that's really engaging and caring. And so what does the teacher do there? So there's all of these, scenarios of being aware and before then applying whatever strategy might be required, or I think really in the relationship, what's required in that teacher-student relationship that supports both so they have the best result.
Yeah, so you've mentioned a couple of times heart rate variability. So this is a really interesting, novel part of your research and some of your work. It's actually interesting what you said before about the teacher mentioning that actually maybe we should wear these all day, and it's a way to provide feedback, maybe even to the higher ups or the system or whatever. But so that was really, really cool stuff during the classroom interactions, I think. And so what did you find, or what sort of surprised you maybe about what you found with that aspect of the method?
Yes, that was interesting, and understanding, yes, what's happening there. Obviously, we're looking for the heart, the beat in between heartbeats. So the bigger the beat between the gap between the heartbeats, the more calm and relaxed that teacher is, and the more the parasympathetic system is activated. So what we noticed is, and I had to measure the different interactions, so whether they were regulatory, so they're regulating the student, more compassionate, or whether the teacher was perhaps, being more corrective, or perhaps not as compassionate, that what would happen, we noticed differences in teachers' heart rate variability. So when they were more regulatory, there was higher heart rate variability, and when it was lower, yes, you could see that perhaps their heart rate variability was lower as well. Interesting, after the teachers who did have the modules noticed that there was they had more heart rate variability than before. So being able to use strategies, I think, to calm themselves, that self-compassion led them to improve their heart rate variability. And even when they were interacting with perhaps, sometimes there might be situations in the class where perhaps some students were not as regulated as they could be, and the teacher trying to intervene. Before the modules, there was less heart rate variability, but after, I actually noticed that improved. So it was very interesting to see how by having that extra information and ways to, practice self-compassion and understand what's going on with children, that helped improve what was happening for them with their stress levels. Really what we're saying, their stress seemed to reduce somewhat. So and obviously there's more research that needs to be done in that area. Interesting, you say novel. Apparently, and as I looked at all the research, and I was told by people around me that were supervising me and mentoring me, that it hadn't been done in a classroom where they just had their lesson. Usually it would be in a lab or somewhere where a lesson was told, they had to present a lesson in a certain way. So it was just, do what you do and let's see what happens. So it was a good way to monitor that. And so, I'm hopeful that leads to more research so that we can continue to explore that.
Yeah. Oh no, I think it's a wonderful addition to how we might start to assess these things and identify change, and it's so interesting that if there's greater variability in the length between beats, then that's related to more regulation. Secondly, higher heart rate variability after an intervention, so we can sort of actually intervene at that level. But not only that, after an intervention, higher heart rate variability even during more difficult, interactional moments with kids. So, it's very interesting, isn't it? It does seem that even on these very, psychophysiological levels, we can make a real impact with what is a relatively it's a comprehensive intervention in a way, although in another way, it's kind of like, 8 modules or whatever, and
Yes.
yet a significant change.
Yes. Yes. Simple, yet, so valuable. And some of the comments I would then have is that, because I'm presenting these to schools since then as well, and I touch base with the principals every now and again, and they say, we still talk about this in our, staff meetings, or, their life skill. They're not just a wellbeing workshop. They're not something you go to for an hour and then you get on with your life. It's more about understanding. So the more we understand how we work and what we need, then we're going to be more able to do that with students as well. So many of the strategies that we talked about how to regulate students were really also important for teachers to know how to do that for themselves as well. So yes, I think it's an ongoing benefit understanding it, and I really encourage them to keep seeking out more information, your book, Stan, James's work, Paul's work. There's so much work out there that is really beneficial to keep that message going and to understand, again, what's happening so that they're able to continue their process of self-compassion and with others as well.
I noticed that you do go also, kind of like beyond well-being and into social justice, I guess, kind of elements to it all as well. How do you see compassion and social justice fitting together in an educational environment or in teacher education?
Well, I think both are, it's important, whether it's in higher education or in the classroom, is that for teachers to be aware, well, first of all, if we take, their training, they've all come from different backgrounds. Some have more privileges than others. There's cultural things to take into account. There's all the diversity to take into account. How much of that is being recognised, I suppose, at, the higher educational level, but also then teaching teachers about this. So when they're in the classroom, what's going on there for students, so that there will be different levels of experiences and backgrounds that will affect their learning as well. So how do we bring that in and understand it, and then know how to support students from those different backgrounds, so that we can have that equitable, I suppose, experience for them all. But even, my research, especially when I was writing the chapter for the book, talked about, there are some institutions that perhaps don't really look at that very well. And it's so critical so that when teachers leave, they've all had the same opportunity to be trained as teachers, regardless of what's going on for them in their social backgrounds and experiences that they've had.
I mean, if you were given responsibility for sort of redesigning or zhuzhing up undergraduate teacher education, what would be some of the most important changes you'd make to help future teachers flourish and to help them help their students flourish as well?
Well, I think first of all, let's start with compassion for them and the profession that they're going into, and recognize that it usually attracts certain people that want to work, with children and adolescents. So that's really important. Let's include more child development and adolescent development so they understand that different stages, different things are happening. Otherwise, they can be seen as mini adults, and they're not. They're growing and developing. There are critical stages that they need to have certain things happen. And if they've missed it because of trauma, then teachers need to be aware of that. We need, that's where the science of learning comes in. I think it's really understanding the different levels of learning. It's not just cognitive, it's strongly emotional, and there's physiological. That it's not just, it's not just a cognitive thing anymore. It's really understanding all areas of, how we grow and develop, and that's really important. Psychoeducation, I'd have more of that in there so that teachers are more aware of their own responses, so that if they are feeling stressed, it's like, oh, I'm feeling stressed, what do I need? Have I been practicing self-compassion? And I think we need to have that. Actually, I think that'd be great across the board at all degrees, but definitely here. And, really encouraging that, sense of understanding, as you said, for social justice. People come from all different backgrounds. What's happening here? Rather than seeing it as something that, makes us different. But how do we connect as a human family and support each other rather than putting people into boxes and categories? I think that's something that's missing. And I understand there's, a lot of things happening in the world and different diagnoses, but I'd really think it'd be great if we could start also looking at what connects us. And I think that's a really important part so that we can help that engagement and connection going forward. And I think for teachers would be so important. So when they enter the classroom, they feel like they do have those resources to draw from, or know where to get these if they need to.
Wonderful stuff. Yeah, that's really sort of working with the model of the mind, isn't it? And being able to understand all of these different ways in. But also that piece on self-compassion. I will let you go in a sec, but imagine an early career teacher walks into your office and sort of says, I love teaching, but I think I'm burning out. And I'm sure there would be a lot to discuss if someone did that. But what might be the first thing that you would want them to understand or want them to know, maybe even about themselves?
I think just understanding that when they're overwhelmed, there's so much happening at that time, and perhaps they're not really feeling supported or even understanding what's going on. It's a huge role to walk into a classroom. As I said, there could be up to 30 children in that classroom, and they're all depending on this teacher. And if the teacher doesn't understand what's going on for children and doesn't understand what's happening for themselves, well then, yes, that they're going to be in a situation where they will feel overwhelmed and stress will build. If they're not understanding about their own needs and how to meet those needs and understand their reactions, why am I reacting this way? And ways to know how to calm themselves and to engage and connect with children. And I think that's important with students. If they see it just, I'm walking in, and yes, they're a teacher, they're meant to be teaching a subject, but there's so much more which they're not equipped to do, and we need to acknowledge that and give them the tools to be able to do that. And I would focus with that teacher on, let's look at your needs, which ones aren't being met. I would start there first. Let's start with self-compassion and then look at what else do you need to know? What is it that you haven't got that you need to know? So really be guided and directed by that so that they are then more aware and meeting their own needs, so that when they enter that classroom, perhaps they feel just a little bit more secure and aware of what's needed. And not to, I think when we, for all of us, if we feel overwhelmed and, we have an anxiety response, it's very scary and it's overwhelming. But if we understand what's happening and what we need to regulate, then you're going to be more able to to do the role. But wouldn't it be great if that was an undergraduate teacher training, so that when she did enter the classroom, she already had some of that, or he or they, into the classroom? I think that's, where I would start.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful stuff. I mean, it's such an important, such a profound role in our society, isn't it, to be a teacher? And
Absolutely.
it's such a important phase of a young person's life too, and a child's life, and yet it's tricky and challenging, and these humans trying to do their best. So I really do appreciate you're putting your whole heart into this work, I think, Rita. So I really appreciate that. But yeah, Dr. Rita Princi-Hubbard, thank you very much for speaking with me on Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thank you, Stan. It's been a real pleasure.